Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Pleasure to be here. And I do want to explain my brother's absence. He just has a terrible bad back. He's had 2 back surgeries, and as of about 10 days ago, the pain so bad, he literally cannot get out of bed. So he wishes he were here, but he's in bed in Amherst, Massachusetts. And before I get started on McNamara, I guess I should say, people often ask, what's it like to do a book with your brother? This was our first collaboration. It went beautifully. It turned out that we have a similar writing voice. So friends of ours, people who've known us for decades, look at the book and they can't tell where one of us might have stopped writing and the other picked up. So that was a blessing that we have the same writing voice. We're just the 2 siblings, no other siblings, and we've been close friends and fond of each other for decades. And as Bill likes to say, how did we resolve differences over the McNamara book? Well, Bill is 6.5 years older than I am, and he said anytime we hit a bump in the road, he invoked seniority. So let me begin with 3 vignettes about McNamara, and then I'm going to go back and talk about how he got to the point in his life where these things happen. So the first, turn the clock back to July 1965. Lyndon Johnson is now president. We have roughly 15 to 20,000 troops in Vietnam, but they're there as advisors, quote unquote. We're not yet involved in combat in Vietnam. And Lyndon Johnson convenes his war cabinet, in effect, up at Camp David to talk about what to do next. And earlier that year, McNamara, the defense secretary, and McGeorge Bundy, the national security advisor in the White House, had written a memo that's come to be known as the Fork in the Road memo. It was written in January '65, and in it they basically said to Johnson, we can't continue on the way we are. Either we've got to draw down and pull out, or we have to escalate. And so he brought everybody together up at Camp David that July, and they discussed what to do. So you have the defense secretary, the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and others. And at those meetings at Camp David, the most vehement and vociferous proponent of escalation was Robert McNamara. So much so that afterward, Clark Clifford, who ultimately succeeded McNamara as defense secretary, Clark Clifford was at the meetings in a private citizen role. At that point, he didn't hold a government post, but Johnson had a lot of faith in his judgment. Clark Clifford later said it was the most extreme articulation of the domino theory that he had ever heard. Now, many in the audience will remember the domino theory, the idea that if South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam, then communism would spread throughout Southeast Asia. And once in Southeast Asia, then it would spread elsewhere. Well, the way McNamara argued it up at Camp David, it would spread to Japan, it would spread to India, it would spread to Turkey and Greece and Africa. It was, as I say, an extreme version. So at those meetings, and then eventually a few days later at the White House, Johnson approved a plan to escalate. That was the decision, July '65, that it became an American war. And within a year, we had 200,000 troops in Vietnam, combat troops. And within 2 years, we had 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam. Okay, that's vignette 1. Vignette 2, fast forward, April 1967. It's just 8 months later, right? McNamara is talking to his top aide about Vietnam policy, a man named John McNaughton. And John McNaughton, unbeknownst to McNamara, and unbeknownst to historians until my brother and I located this, kept a secret diary. And in that diary, he chronicled his conversations with McNamara for a year and a half before McNaughton, died in a commercial airplane crash. And the diary sheds light on what McNamara was really thinking about Vietnam as the months passed. And in April of '67, he says to John McNaughton, quote, "I want to bring the boys home or the troops home from Vietnam so bad I can hardly stand it." April 1967, okay? That fall, he goes up to Harvard. He had been a student at Harvard Business School. And he tells Harvard faculty in a private confidential meeting that many of the claims that the administration and he had been making about progress in Vietnam were untrue. A record of that conversation we found at the Kennedy Library in Boston. It was notes taken by Graham Allison. It may be a name you know. He later became Dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard and an Assistant Secretary of Defense. Okay, third vignette. September 1968. McNamara is now president of the World Bank. He goes to Norfolk News for the commissioning of the aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy comes down with her family from New York and Hyannis and elsewhere for this moment of commissioning. And at the commissioning, McNamara gives an incredibly emotional and eloquent speech about JFK and about Jackie, whom he was very fond of. She went back to Rhode Island that evening at her mother's place in Newport, and she wrote a letter, one of many. And this, again, is a benefit that we had in our research. We've discovered dozens and dozens of letters that Jackie Kennedy wrote to Robert McNamara, beginning in 1961, when he just became Defense Secretary, really right up to near the end of his life. And in this letter, she wrote it in the middle of the night. She goes back home and she's with her family, and she's very emotional. And she writes a letter, and I want to read you a couple of passages from it at the very end. This is what it says. This is Jackie Kennedy to Robert McNamara. "You will see that what you said today changed and affected people's lives more than any words that have ever gone before you. I love you for what you are and for what you suffer and for all you are to me, my dear, dear Bob." So it turns out that Jackie Kennedy and Robert McNamara had an incredibly close relationship, which I'll return to. But here in these vignettes, you're seeing different sides of Robert McNamara. The war hawk, the war dove, the dear friend of Jackie Kennedy, of all people. And so what Bill and I discovered in researching this book is what a complicated person McNamara was. He really lived a double life, especially when the war in Vietnam began. He lived a double life as a proponent of the war, a defender of the war publicly, and in private, an opponent of the war. And this led to a kind of emotional and mental breakdown for Robert McNamara, as you'll hear. So let me back up now and talk about his life and how did this man become who he was in these vignettes? What manner of man was he? What shaped him to become this person who was waging a war he privately opposed. So we'll go back to the beginning. In this photo, he's a Boy Scout, an Eagle Scout in Berkeley and Oakland. He grew up in Northern California, went to high school in the Oakland area, and then went to Berkeley. As a Stanford graduate, I found it interesting to discover that he'd actually wanted to go to Stanford, but his father vetoed, said it was too expensive. True today, too. So he ended up at Berkeley, where as a junior, he was one of probably 2,500 students in his class to be admitted to Phi Beta Kappa. He was a brilliant student. He grew up in a household with a very aloof, distant, cold father who was a salesman, a shoe salesman, who traveled around the West and led a very kind of formal life at home, you know, always dressed up for dinner and everything, and had very little emotional connection to Robert McNamara. His mother, however, doted on him and set standards for him that clearly were standards that he felt he needed to live by. He needed to excel. She set these standards for him. And, you know, she was very much in the middle of his life at Berkeley. And then from Berkeley, he goes to Harvard Business School. Very quickly becomes the #1 student in his class at Harvard Business School. His mother is writing him letters, and again, we were the beneficiary of having access to these letters, which no historians or biographers had previously seen. And in these letters, she's literally saying the following kinds of things. Bob, you know it's cold in Cambridge. Don't forget to wear your overcoat. Bob, are you brushing your teeth regularly? I mean, the guy's in his mid-20s, and his mother is kind of leaning on him about these kinds of things, and she's pressing him all the time to excel, which he does. So let's advance the photos and see. So here he is as a young man. Those of you who lived through the war era recognize that part in his hair, those rimless glasses and the slick back hair. That is the epitome of Robert McNamara. Okay, we'll get to that in a second. So he excels at Harvard Business School. World War II begins. And it turns out that the Army Air Corps, there was not yet a United States Air Force. That didn't come until the late 1940s after the war. The Army Air Corps was deeply engaged in World War II in the European theater and, of course, in the Pacific theater. And they needed to keep track of aircraft pilots, fuel, munitions, everything to understand the state of our air power in those days. So they turned to Harvard Business School to help train statisticians to come to Washington to get into a unit that was called statistical control. Robert McNamara was recruited for that, wanted to get involved, and did get involved in stat control in Washington. And by the way, as an interesting family connection, Felicity's father was the chief of staff at Stat Control. And we have a wonderful story of how, R.J. Miller, who later became the president of Ford and then dean of the Stanford Business School, came into Stat Control for the first time in Washington. And the first person he meets is Brandon Barringer, who tells him, oh, it's great, you're here, welcome. It's a break right now, you can go out on the mall, they're all playing volleyball. So there's this nice family connection. Okay, so at Stat Control, McNamara plays an important role in managing our air campaigns, first in Europe and then in the Pacific. And he gets involved in planning the firebombing of Tokyo. Many of you may remember this, or certainly have read about it. The firebombing of Tokyo was as deadly in many ways as the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The first wave of firebombing in Tokyo resulted in 100,000 deaths, 100,000 deaths. McNamara's role in this was to help them figure out what was the most effective, what was the optimal vector for the bombers coming in over Tokyo. And what they had discovered at times in Europe was they were flying in too high. They were operating at 20,000 feet. And the reason is that was safer for the pilots and the crews. McNamara helped figure out that they actually needed to come in over Tokyo at 7,000 feet, which was far more dangerous and far more lethal. So they did that. And Curtis LeMay, a name you may remember, he later became head of the Air Force. He was in charge of those raids, and he led those raids. He was in the lead plane in those bombing raids. Later, decades later, when McNamara was asked about this, he said to Errol Morris in The Fog of War, he said, if we had lost the war, Curtis LeMay and I would have been convicted of war crimes. He understood what they were doing. He did it because he felt it was necessary at the time. Okay, the war ends, and the man who ran Stat Control came up with this crazy idea. He wrote to a bunch of CEOs around the United States and said, I've got 10 brilliant men here who've worked with me during World War II. We will come and help you run your company as a team. Would you be interested? And so Henry Ford, the son of the founder of Ford Motor Company, said, hell yes, I need you, because it turned out, all the auto companies during the war had converted to military, building tanks and all kinds of military equipment. GM came out, figured out how to reconvert back to automobile production, and other companies did too. Ford was struggling after the war. And so Henry Ford needed help. So he brought them up to Michigan. These 10 guys showed up. They took psychological tests. Very interesting to go back and look at the test results and the written comments by the test givers of these 10 men, including Robert McNamara. And the 10 men, what they determined through those tests was McNamara by far the smartest one, okay? So they go to work at Ford, and they discover the place is a mess. They hadn't even been keeping books accurately. So they brought in accountants. The accountants spent months. They couldn't figure out what was going on. It was clear Ford was losing money hand over fist. So McNamara and his team go to work, and very quickly McNamara begins to rise up through the ranks of Ford. And as he does, he operates a management style that you might describe as terror. He is brutal. He convenes meetings, and when people say things that he thinks are flawed, he tells them to their face in the meeting while their other colleagues are there. He'll say, that's wrong, that's stupid, why did you bother coming in here to tell me that? Go back and redo it. So he was an incredibly tough executive at Ford, but he got results. And by the way, we're now talking, remember, 1950s. No one had really heard of Ralph Nader yet. Robert McNamara at Ford made a big deal about auto safety. And he said to Henry Ford, we got to put seat belts in these cars. We got to do all kinds of things to make them safer to drive. He pressed that so hard that Ford almost fired him. Henry Ford almost fired him for pushing too hard on safety. So you got this image of this very tough but efficient and effective boss. Underneath that, what's going on? Well, the best example of that I can give you is he developed a terrible problem of grinding his teeth. And so Robert McNamara goes to the local dentist. He chose to live in Ann Arbor, by the way, rather than Grosse Pointe or one of the communities around Detroit where the wealthy auto executives lived. He wanted to be in an academic environment rather than a corporate environment. He's developing this tooth grinding problem. He goes to see a dentist, and I guess this is what they prescribe in Detroit, of course, for tooth grinding. The guy gave him a piece of tire tread, and he said, "Bob, if you put this in your mouth at night, it will stop the grinding." So next morning he wakes up, he's chewed through this piece of tire tread. That's how tight he was, how wound up he was. The stress that he had was tremendous. He used to go to meetings and they would sort of quietly laugh about him because he had a habit of hitching up his pants while he was seated at the table. Again, this is a sign of stress and tightness and everything. And by the time the meetings were over, the pant cuffs were up at his knees. And, you know, his fellow executives sort of laughed at it, and at the same time, they were terrified of him, okay? All right, so now we get to 1960. John F. Kennedy is elected president, and he's putting together his cabinet. And friends of his, people he respects, like Robert Lovett, who was one of the sort of quote-unquote wise men after World War II, suggested Bob McNamara. They said he's a great executive. He's turning around the Ford Motor Company. By this point, he had become president at Ford by the time of the election in 1960. So Kennedy says, let me see if I can bring him in to be Treasury Secretary. So Sergeant Bobby Kennedy gets on the phone, calls McNamara's office in Detroit, says to McNamara, the president-elect would like to have you talk to Sergeant Shriver, Kennedy's brother-in-law, about some cabinet jobs. And McNamara says, well, I'm flattered. I can do that next week. And Bobby says, no, today. And so Shriver flies out to Detroit and says, how would you like to be Treasury Secretary? And McNamara says, not qualified. He says, how about defense? And McNamara says, not qualified. And Shriver says, well, at least give the president-elect the courtesy of coming to Washington to talk to him. JFK had never met Robert McNamara. All he knew was this reputation that he'd heard about. So McNamara goes to Washington, and they offer him the defense job. And he hesitates, and he says, you know, I need to think about this. So he goes back to Detroit, he thinks about it, and then he comes back almost reluctantly to Washington, and he goes to Georgetown, to the Kennedy residence in Georgetown, to meet with JFK and Bobby. And he comes in, and JFK and Bobby are sitting on a sofa, and McNamara is sitting in an armchair, and he pulls out a piece of paper. And he said, Mr. President, I've got a letter here. I want to make clear that there are a couple of conditions about my coming to Washington if you want me to be defense secretary. Number one, I get to hire anybody I want at the Defense Department. Essentially, without saying the words, I'm not going to hire a bunch of political hacks that you and Bobby may want me to hire. And secondly, I'm not going to get involved in social life in Washington. I'm not going to be part of the Georgetown kind of social set. This is a great scene, you can imagine this. He hands the letter to Bobby, or I guess to JFK first. President-elect looks at it, hands it to Bobby, and Bobby says, what do you think? And JFK says, fine, great. They go out on the front steps of the House and announce that McNamara is the new defense secretary. Okay, so he comes to Washington in 1961. And what Kennedy wants him to do, this has nothing to do with Vietnam yet. What Kennedy wants him to do is turn the management of the Defense Department into a rationally managed system. It was not rationally managed. Every one of the services put together its own budget requests for Congress. Each of the armed services had their supporters in the House and in the Senate who wanted to support whatever the chief said he needed for his service. And so there were duplicative weapons systems. There were no checks on what was being spent. It was a crazy system. In effect, the Secretary of Defense did not run the Defense Department. McNamara came in like a bull into a china shop, and he did there manage the way he managed at Ford, and he really imposed with a bunch of young, smart guys just, out of graduate school, known as the whiz kids. They stormed into the Pentagon, and they issued orders, and they made demands that immediately alienated the armed services, and especially the generals and the admirals. They said, who the hell are these guys coming in and telling us how to run our business? But it was very effective. The kind of thing that they did was McNamara looked and said, well, wait a minute, we're building a plane for the Air Force and a plane for the Navy. Why can't we build one plane for both? And so he imposed a kind of cost-benefit budget process that stands to this day. Now, I'm not sure what's going on in today's Defense Department, but up until now, the reforms that McNamara put in place were still there many, many decades later. And if Vietnam had never existed, Robert McNamara would probably go down in American history as the most reviled within the department, Defense Secretary, and the most effective. However, that was not to be his fate. Okay, let's start here talking about Vietnam. So here, this is the picture, shortly after McNamara becomes Defense Secretary. Here he is later up at Hyannisport with the president. Outdoors guy, he loved to ski, very physically active man. Here he is with Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and here alone in the office of the Secretary of Defense. So Vietnam. Kennedy comes into office and is ambivalent about Vietnam. And if you think back to that era, I was, in high school in those days, or even in junior high. What was the major issue of the day? It was Berlin. It was Cuba. It wasn't Vietnam. And so the attention was focused on other areas of the world. And shortly after McNamara became Defense Secretary, he went to Vietnam to kind of assess the scene. He comes back to the White House and he makes a presentation to the president that calls for increasing the American presence in Vietnam, possibly including combat troops. We're now talking about 1961. He thinks this is what Kennedy probably wants. And he's stunned right there in the cabinet room or the Oval Office when Kennedy says, Bob, I'm not so sure this is a good idea. Kennedy had gone to Vietnam with his brother Bobby in the 1950s. Kennedy was very sophisticated about world politics. He traveled widely. You all know his father was immensely wealthy. And so he had an extraordinary life as a young man traveling around the world. And he understood that Vietnam was not a simple place to wage a war. And so he was not sure. And he said in that meeting, he said, we can send our boys over there, the bands will play, and then they'll come back in body bags. So he was not clear about what he wanted to do, although he too, like McNamara, believed in the domino theory. But it was an important moment for McNamara, and what's interesting about it is at that same meeting, after McNamara makes the argument for escalating, we're not talking yet about massive escalation, but some escalation, and he finds Kennedy doesn't want that. He turns on a dime and makes the case for not going. And I want to read you a comment from a man who knew McNamara well, became his Air Force secretary when McNamara was the defense secretary. And I think of all the things you're going to hear today about Robert McNamara and Vietnam, this may be the single most enlightening comment. This is a man named Eugene Zuckert, who was Air Force Secretary, had worked with McNamara at Harvard Business School. When McNamara was getting his degree, they offered him a job there as an instructor and a professor, and Zuckert was an instructor. And he said of McNamara, quote, he was, quote, never more vigorous in defending a position than the one his boss had told him to take, which he really didn't believe in. And he always compensated to make sure that his boss's position was the one that prevailed. So that's a devastating quote about opportunism, I think, ambition, etc. Okay. We hit the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a disaster. McNamara learned from that he couldn't trust the judgment he felt of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the CIA, which ran the invasion. And then we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where, we're right on the edge of a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union. And McNamara plays a moderating role through the first part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The generals are coming in and telling Kennedy, you got to invade, you got to attack, and Kennedy is saying, whoa, 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 whoa. If we're not careful, we're going to end up, destroying the world, the nuclear, war. So there's this amazing moment. The quarantine or blockade has gone into effect to stop Soviet freighters carrying missiles to Cuba. And this is probably the tensest few days of the missile crisis, because we are now actively engaged, our Navy, with their merchant marine vessels in the Caribbean. And this could have been a detonation point for a military conflict. And McNamara's meeting at the Pentagon. And the chief of naval operations is describing what he says the rules of engagement are going to be in the Caribbean. And McNamara listens to him, and then he says to Admiral Anderson, I don't give a goddamn what John Paul Jones would have done. This is what we're going to do right now. Again, decisive, effective. You can imagine what Admiral Anderson thought of McNamara after that. At the end of the crisis, he prepared plans for an invasion, which might have happened. Fortunately, it didn't happen. So in the last months of the Kennedy presidency, Kennedy is trying, of course he doesn't know he's about to be assassinated. He's trying to think about what to do in Vietnam. And in 1963, just a month or two before Dallas, he instructs McNamara to prepare a plan to draw down American forces in Vietnam. Would he have acted on that had he survived? We'll never know. But it's clear he was ambivalent about Vietnam. Okay, the terrible day in Dallas, a turning point in so many ways. And the scene, I'll describe it to you. When the body comes back from Dallas, Air Force One pulls up at Andrews Air Force Base. Lyndon Johnson has been sworn in on Air Force One in Dallas. Kennedy's body is in a coffin in the plane. McNamara and Bobby Kennedy fly out to Andrews together to greet the arriving plane. And Bobby, of course, rushes on board to talk to Jackie, and McNamara waits. Johnson comes out and says to McNamara, I want you to come back to the White House with me. They get on the helicopter, now Marine One, with President Johnson aboard. They go to the White House. They talk with Rusk and McGeorge Bundy. And then McNamara goes home for a very solemn and sad dinner. And then the phone rings, and it's Bobby. And he says, Bob, you got to come out to Bethesda Naval Hospital. They're doing the autopsy, and Jackie wants you here. And by this time, McNamara and Jackie had developed this extraordinarily close relationship. You'll see if you look at the book, the letters that she sent him are so extraordinary. She saw in him someone she felt she could trust. He was a man, unlike her husband, as far as she could tell, who was not a skirt chaser. He was a man, she discovered, who loved poetry as she did, loved music as she did, and so they began to bond. And the first signs of that, are exchanges, playful exchanges, Valentine's cards, and things like that. And in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, she sends a note to McNamara, and you'll see it in the book. She talks about how she's just a girl in the street, and she's trying to understand what's going on, and all she knows is the phone is ringing 24/7, that Dean Rusk is sleeping at a desk downstairs, or it's Dean Rusk is upstairs, this is it, in the Lincoln bedroom, sound asleep, with his hand pressing down on a cactus plant. But he's so tired, he doesn't even feel that his hand is being pricked by the cactus. She's watching the Cuban Missile Crisis unfold, and she writes this letter to Bob, my God, I'm so glad you're there, Bob, as a kind of voice of reason. Okay, these letters continue, they go back and forth over and over and over again. So the night of the assassination, he goes up to the presidential suite atop Bethesda Naval Hospital, and he sits next to Jackie. She's sitting on a kind of high chair, and he sits on the floor next to her. And he sits there all night next to her, and all night she's still in that ghastly appearance with the pink suit that is splattered with her husband's blood and brain matter. She's sitting there, and she is over and over again telling McNamara and others what happened in Dallas. Can you imagine this scene? And he says to her in the middle of the night, Jackie, you're going to need a place to live. You can't live in the White House anymore. And he says, I will buy you a house in Georgetown. That clearly captures how he felt about her. Okay, so we get past the assassination, and you really have to understand what a contrast it was to go from this urbane, elegant president and first lady to this incredibly coarse, very skillful political president, LBJ. LBJ knew how to get things done in Congress far more than John Kennedy did. That's why we got the civil rights legislation that we're still, dealing with today, the Voting Rights Act and everything. That was Lyndon Johnson, not John F. Kennedy. But Johnson operated very differently from Kennedy. And one of the things that McNamara loved about JFK was that he forgave him for his errors, McNamara's errors. And just a few days after becoming defense secretary, his press secretary says, Mr. Secretary, you need to get the Washington defense correspondents in to talk to you. So they come into his office, they sit around, and in the middle of the meeting, what does he tell them? He tells them that the missile gap, one of the main foreign policy issues that JFK ran on and won on, namely that the Soviet Union had more missiles than we did, was totally false. We had discovered it was exactly the opposite with the introduction of new collection systems, including spy satellites. He announces this to the press corps, and as he said later, I couldn't believe what happened. They all grabbed their pencils and notebooks and raced to the door, right, to tell the world that there was no missile crisis. The next day he calls JFK and he says, Mr. President, I need to resign. I mean, my God, what have I just done to you? And JFK says to him, don't worry, Bob, we all make mistakes. So he had this kind of bond with JFK. He didn't have any kind of relationship with LBJ when Johnson became president. And so he's trying to figure out Johnson. And sure enough, 1964, August, Gulf of Tonkin, presidential election year. North Vietnamese Navy vessels supposedly fire on one and then a second US destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin. And when you go back and you look through the now declassified memos and cables of all of this, you see very clearly that there may never have been any kind of attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, and almost certainly the second attack on the destroyer Turner Joy did not take place. And the cause of firing by North Vietnam, if it did take place, was that the CIA had recruited a bunch of South Vietnamese to go up in speedboats along the coast of North Vietnam and fire on their radar and other facilities. So they were provoked if they did attack. So what does Johnson and McNamara do? They go to Congress and ask for a resolution, essentially to go to war in Vietnam. And they get it. It's almost unanimous, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So the tone for action is now set. And then, you know, Johnson is elected president, and we get to 65, which I've already talked about, the fork in the road memo, the meetings at Camp David, the escalation, and McNamara's doubts about it. And through 66, the rest of 66, 67, he's still defense secretary. He's waging a war he doesn't believe is militarily winnable. Instead of going into the Oval Office and, to paraphrase, remember George Aiken, the Republican senator from Vermont, whose formula for ending the Vietnam War was very simple: declare victory and bring the boys home. McNamara never went into the Oval Office and said, Mr. President, we cannot win this war the way we're waging it, even with 500,000 combat troops. Just end it. Let's end it. He never did that. What he did do was try to persuade Johnson to wind down the war, to try to enter in some kind of negotiation if he could. And there's back and forth. At one point, McNamara inserts himself into diplomacy. Dean Rusk basically tells him, you're wasting your time, Bob. And so McNamara is now running diplomacy that got nowhere to try to end the war. So he's trying to end the war, but he's now getting regularly overruled by Johnson to keep escalating in various ways. And mind you, the Joint Chiefs at this point are saying, we can't win this war the way we're fighting it. If you want to win this war, Mr. President, we've got the answer. Invade North Vietnam. We're bombing them, but you send, 100 to 200,000 American combat troops into North Vietnam, we'll win the war. And Johnson and McNamara didn't want to do that. And the reason was simple. They feared that if they did that, China would enter the war, the Soviet Union might enter the war, and I think quite correctly they feared that if we go full force into North Vietnam, we may end up in a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. China at that point had very few nuclear weapons. So McNamara is trying to persuade Johnson to wind down the war. And then in, I guess it's August of, it must have been 67, he goes, or April of 67, he goes up to the Hill, and for the first time publicly, he talks about his doubts about the war. Because throughout this period, he's publicly proclaiming we're making progress in Vietnam over and over and over again. He goes up to the Hill, he expresses some doubts, and Johnson summons him down to the Oval Office and berates him for 4 hours. And McNamara later tells his deputy defense chief, Roswell Gilpatrick, who wrote this down, and you can see, he says, McNamara says, I've never been through anything like that. the president took me to the woodshed, basically, and beat me up verbally for 4 hours. Here he is with Maxwell Taylor on the left, the chairman, and I think that's Curtis LeMay on the right. A piece of McNamara, and here he is in Vietnam, hiking some more, Vietnam. There, if that captures the attitude as the war is kind of a stalemate at this point. So at a certain point, Johnson figures out this guy's no longer got his heart in it. I got to get rid of him. And just at that moment, we're now in mid-67, the president of the World Bank says, my term's coming to an end later this year. I don't want to be renominated. And McNamara thinks to himself, that would be an interesting job. And Johnson thinks to himself, that might be the perfect place to put Bob. And so, lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. And McNamara learns about this from a news report. The president doesn't tell him. He hears through the news media that he's no longer going to be defense chief. He's going to be president of the World Bank. So he calls his buddy, Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, and says, Kay, what happened? And she said, well, Bob, it's obvious what happened. You were fired. So off he goes eventually to the World Bank. And he does good things at the World Bank. It's a kind of penance, I think, for him. The Vietnam War, he's trying to shake the reputation. He is probably, I think, the most hated man in America because of the Vietnam War. Johnson, by this point, has decided not to run for re-election. Bobby Kennedy is running until he's assassinated. McCarthy is coming in second in New Hampshire. The whole political firmament is getting shaken up. And McNamara goes off to the World Bank, where he does good things by and large. And by the way, you all remember the Pentagon Papers, this voluminous study of what went wrong in Vietnam. It was instigated by who else? Robert McNamara, who said, we need to know how we got into this mess. And so this voluminous report was prepared. And one day, Les Gelb, who had managed it at the Pentagon, they go over in a truck to the World Bank, and they cart up to McNamara's office in the World Bank these volumes and volumes and volumes of reports that had been produced and documents. And they put them down in his office, and Gelb says, Bob, Mr. Secretary, here's the Pentagon report. McNamara never looks at it. He never looks at it. So, okay. Let's get to the last part of his life, which in many ways is a sad story. He leaves the World Bank and he wants to understand where he went wrong. And he throws himself into that effort as energetically as he'd thrown himself into everything else that he had ever done. And he becomes a tormented man. He was tormented even toward the end of the time as defense secretary. The day that he stepped down, there was a White House ceremony, and he literally could not speak. He stood at a lectern in the East Wing that no longer stands, and he said, I can't speak. I'm just so overwhelmed with emotion. And so for the last decades of his life, he tried valiantly, you have to give him credit for this, to understand where he went wrong. And I think it's true that there's really almost nobody in modern American history who's held such a senior position in our government who made grievous errors and then went back late in life to try to understand where he'd gone wrong. And his book, In Retrospect was the title, came out in '95. And it is, up to a point, a tough examination of the mistakes that they made, including overemphasis on the domino theory and other miscalculations they made. And he wanted also to draw lessons from Vietnam about when should the United States go to war, how should it go to war, under what circumstances. So in his book, he has essentially lessons learned. And if you look at them today, you'd be astounded at how apt they are, not only for today, but the recent decades. I'll just enunciate a few of them for you. Do not go to war unless you know what the exit strategy is going to be. Do not go to war unless you have the full support of the American people. Do not go to war unless the Congress of the United States fully supports. Do not go to war unless you're prepared for all the unpredictable things that happen in war, the fog of war, in effect. So do not go to war, and this is what applied so much in Vietnam, and when you think about it, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and now in Iran. Do not go to war if you do not understand the culture, politics, and history of the nation in which you are waging war. He laid these all out very clearly in his book in 1995, and he was bitterly disappointed that few people in the defense establishment read it. And so I've been very fortunate out at Stanford to get to know Bill Perry, who was defense secretary, the second defense secretary in the Clinton administration. And as I was telling Bill about my book project, he said to me one day, "Oh my gosh, I've got to show you the book that McNamara gave me." And so it turns out that on the first day that Bill Perry became defense secretary, he walked into this grand office of the defense secretary. There's nothing in there but this gigantic desk at this point. And on the desk, what's the only thing on the desk? A copy of McNamara's book that McNamara had obviously arranged with people at the Defense Department to leave there. And this is the inscription that he wrote to Bill Perry. Quote, "To Bill, in the hope that this book will help you avoid some of our mistakes. With admiration, Bob." So let me close with an account of a oral, it's more than an oral history conference. It's a conference about the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were a series of these that took place many decades after the crisis. And there was one in Havana. And it was attended by former Soviet officials, former American officials, and Cuban officials. And the host was Fidel Castro. So McNamara is there. They're talking about what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis, how close we came to catastrophe. And at a certain point, McNamara's got a plane to catch, so he gets up and he's ready to leave. And as he's about to walk out the door, Castro says, "Mr. Secretary, in 10 years, we'll do another one of these. I hope you will come back." And McNamara turns around and says to Castro, "In 10 years, I will be in hell." So let me stop there. If you'd love to take some questions before we wind down. So wait for the microphone.
All right, thank you. And if you could just pass that to the next person.
Sure. So I work for the World Bank, and McNamara and his wife in particular are remembered very fondly. But in your telling now, he sounds like a spineless, lying suck-up, particularly in his early career. So what has sort of caused this rehabilitation, this sort of public self-flagellation about wars and his role in them? What made the change?
His conscience, I think. I think the way my brother often puts it is that he not only wanted to do well, which was, the standard that his mother had set for him, but he also wanted to do good. And he made efforts as defense secretary. It was a failure at the time, for example, to make the military forces much more diverse, not so much with women in that era, but with people of color. He believed in the some people often have asked me, well, why did he stay as defense secretary during those last years? And I think the answer is that he both feared Johnson a little bit. He didn't want to lose his job. And the two of them had this kind of reinforcement loop going, where when it became clear to McNamara what he thought Johnson wanted, and he made the case that he thought Johnson wanted, and Johnson embraced it, and then Johnson became more enthusiastic about the case, and then McNamara became more enthusiastic. I think over time, he understood this kind of thing was going on, and he had regrets. And so I didn't say, I should have mentioned, there was this searing moment in late '66, I think it was. Some of you may remember this, when a man came and sat on the ground below McNamara's office outside the Pentagon with his child and poured gasoline or kerosene on himself and was ready to light a match to immolate himself. And the people passing by somehow persuaded him to let the child go. But he did end up burning himself to death, and McNamara saw this outside his window. And he went home that night, and he said not a word about it to his family. And in his book, several decades later, he wrote how much he regretted what had happened, that it was a moment that changed his outlook about Vietnam. And it was a moment that made him understand that he was disconnected in a way from his own family. So I think that the short answer to your question is that the McNamara, the human McNamara, the humane McNamara did exist, and it was in conflict with the ambitious McNamara. And eventually, after the war, he decided to emphasize the more humane side of his character. Any other thoughts? Please.
Oh. He waited a long time to write his book. I'm just kind of reading now. He died at age 93.
Right.
And I'm backdating it, what, 87, 78, when he wrote his book?
He wrote the book in 90, it was published in 95, and he died in 09.
Okay, so 14 years.
Yeah.
So he was almost 79, not 80.
Yeah. He waited a long time. It was another puzzle. The day that the announcement about his appointment as World Bank president was made, and he called Katharine Graham, Bobby Kennedy calls him up and says, Bob, okay, you know, this is the moment for you to make the break with LBJ. Go out and denounce the war, for God's sakes. And he refused to do it. And he wouldn't speak about Vietnam until the book came out. It was very strange. And people wonder, why was that so? And I think the answer to that is a kind of misconceived loyalty to the presidency. And in fact, in the book, you'll see a Life magazine article about McNamara that was written just a few months after he became World Bank secretary. And in it, he's pressed by the author, why did you stay, Mr. Secretary? Why didn't you break with the president? And his answer ultimately is loyalty. And the interviewer says to him, but isn't there a higher loyalty in Washington? And the interviewer didn't do what, of course, he might have, which was to remind McNamara of the oath of office he took when he became defense secretary, which is the same oath, basically, that the cabinet members still take today, to defend the Constitution of the United States. There's not a word in the oath that they take about the office of the president or the president. But his answer to that was, hell no. There is no higher calling. And if we go down that road, you'll see in the quote in the book from the Life article, it will destroy our democracy.
So the Pentagon Papers were leaked or published after all this happened, but it was his study. Did he make any comment about what was being published from the Pentagon Papers, which was his own study?
Yeah, well, the book in many ways draws on the Pentagon Papers. You know, he had researchers working with him. So he understood, you know, when he went back to look at his own record and mistakes that were made. He did draw on the Pentagon Papers eventually.
But contemporaneously, when it's being, and Ellsberg's being prosecuted, and
Not a word.
he did not step up to talk about it at the time.
No, not a word. Okay, one last question, please.
You mentioned his family. Could you say a few words about them? And then another question.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked about his family.
And one last question.
Yeah.
If he was at Ford in those years, he was probably working next to Edsel Ford. And is there any record of him ever being on this island?
The question is, at Ford, was he working with Edsel Ford? Yes, yes. Well, in fact, I'll answer that question first. He was an advocate of the Edsel, which of course was this huge flop as an automobile, which he always regretted. So on the question of family, it's quite poignant in many ways. He had 3 children with his first wife, who lived many decades. They lived together. She died, and then he remarried later. But the son, Craig, who was the youngest, had, I think, the hardest time dealing with the father who had been the prosecutor of the Vietnam War. And as he was growing up at home in Washington, at a certain point while he was in high school, he took an American flag and hung it on the wall upside down. His father obviously saw this, but said nothing to Craig about it. And then Craig went off to St. Paul's and eventually came out to Stanford. And after a year at Stanford, he just couldn't stand the idea that he was the son of Robert McNamara. And he got involved, as he would tell you himself, in violent anti-war demonstrations at Stanford. Felicity and I witnessed these things. We were students at the same time. And so he got on a motorcycle with a buddy, 2 motorcycles. They drove down to Mexico City. I think Craig got injured on the way. He ended up, hitchhiking down to Santiago, Chile. And then he took a boat out to Easter Island. So think, if you are a young man and you're feeling torn about your relationship with your father and you want to get away, you can't get any more isolated than Easter Island, okay? So he goes out to Easter Island, where he lives for almost a year, part of the time in a cave. His mother finally flies over and says, Craig, come home, come home. We can make this work in effect. And he does go home. He gets a degree at UC Davis. He eventually buys a walnut farm in the Central Valley in California and makes a great success of it. He's one of the model sustainable farmers now in the state of California. Highly, highly respected. And Craig wrote an absolutely wonderful book about his relationship with his family, mostly his father. It came out maybe 3 years ago, and it's called The Lies Our Parents Told. Because Our Fathers Lied. And it's a searing, introspective account of his own turmoil and torment growing up. And I'm happy to report he's a terrific guy. He and his father eventually reconciled up to a point, but fairly well. Has very great children, some of whom are going to take over the walnut farm. And Craig couldn't have been more helpful to me. So I owe him a debt of gratitude. His sisters, I think Kathleen, the middle child, was also unhappy being Robert McNamara's daughter. And she's been very private about her views. And the eldest sister, Margie, whom I know a little bit and my brother knows, has been very complimentary about this book, which makes us feel as if we've done right by McNamara. It's not an exculpatory book at all. but I think it's a book that helps explain him. So thank you all very much for coming. And I'd be happy to... I'd be happy to sign some books. What does an author want to do more?